He was called the mystery man of Europe, a ghost who moved through palaces and parliaments, boardrooms and battlefields. Never in uniform, always in shadow. His name was Basil Zaharoff, and by the time he died in 1936, he had armed nearly every side of nearly every war for half a century. The year is 1886. A Greek arms dealer stands in a naval shipyard in Istanbul, watching as workers assemble the pieces of a submarine. The Nordenfeldt II, named after his Swedish employer. It's a steam-driven vessel, sleek and modern by the standards of the day. The Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II has just purchased it, convinced that this machine will give the Ottoman Navy supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. But there's a problem. The submarine is fundamentally broken. Zaharoff knows this. The designer knows this. The mechanics know this. Steam propulsion cannot work underwater. The boilers need air. The engines overheat. The vessel becomes unstable the moment it submerges. During sea trials, one of these Turkish submarines will rear vertically and sink stern first during a torpedo test, nearly killing its crew. But Zaharoff has already moved on, because 3 months earlier, he sold the first Nordenfeldt submarine to Greece, convincing the Greek government that they needed this weapon to counter Ottoman aggression. And 6 months from now, he'll sell 2 more submarines to Russia, persuading the Tsar's admirals that the Ottoman and Greek fleets now pose an existential threat in the Black Sea. None of these submarines will ever see combat. None of them will function as promised. But Zaharoff will collect his commission on every single sale. This is how you sell a war to everyone. So who was Basil Zaharoff? And how did a man born in a backwater Ottoman town become one of the richest and most feared men in the world? Let's go back to the beginning. Zacharias Basileos Zaharoff was born on October 6, 1849, in Muğla, a small town in southwest Turkey. His father was a Greek notary and commodity dealer. His mother was reportedly blind. The family had spent 2 decades in exile in Russia after anti-Greek pogroms swept the Ottoman Empire in 1821, and they'd only recently returned to Constantinople. Young Zacharias, who would later reinvent himself as Basil Zaharoff, started out as a tour guide in the Galata district of Constantinople. Some historians believe he worked with the city's fire brigades, which in those days operated more like organized looters than rescue services, paid to recover treasures from burning buildings, often after setting the fires themselves. By his early 20s, Zaharoff was already running cons across Europe. In 1872, he married a British woman in Bristol under a fake identity. Then in 1885, posing as Prince Zacharias Basileos Zaharoff, he married an American heiress named Jenny Billings in Philadelphia, before being exposed as a bigamist and fleeing to Rotterdam. He also spent time in the United States working as a confidence man and later as a salesman for a St. Louis railcar business. He tried his hand at various schemes, recruiting Irish girls in Galway to work in American factories, running shipping operations, always moving before the law could catch up with him. But in 1877, something shifted. Zaharoff talked his way into a job as a salesman for Thorsten Nordenfeldt, a Swedish arms manufacturer. The position came through a political journalist in Athens named Etienne Skouloudis, who was impressed by Zaharoff's eloquence and charm, qualities that would become his greatest weapons. The timing was perfect. The Balkans were a powder keg. The Treaty of Berlin had just been signed in 1878, but it had resolved nothing. Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, every nation in the region was rearming, terrified of its neighbors' intentions. Within a decade, Zaharoff would transform from a con artist into the most powerful arms dealer in the world, because he understood something that most people didn't. War is not a product of ideology or patriotism. War is a market, and markets can be manipulated. The 1880s and 1890s were a golden age for arms dealers. The map of Europe was fracturing. Old empires were crumbling, new nations were forming, and every government, from Greece to Turkey, Russia to Spain, Japan to Britain, was racing to modernize its military before its neighbors did. This was the environment Zaharoff thrived in. His genius wasn't just in selling weapons, it was in creating the demand for them. Here's how it worked. In 1886, an American inventor named Hiram Maxim developed the first fully automatic machine gun, a revolutionary weapon that could fire 600 rounds per minute without manual reloading. It was better than anything on the market, including the hand-cranked models that Nordenfelt was selling. Maxim needed to demonstrate his invention to European military officials. He arranged a series of exhibitions in Italy and Austria, inviting dignitaries and generals to watch the weapon in action. But at the first demonstration in La Spezia, Italy, scheduled before an audience that included the Duke of Genoa, Maxim's representatives never showed up. An unknown person had taken them on a tour of the city's brothels and bars the night before, leaving them too hungover to attend the demonstration. Nordenfelt's weapons were showcased instead. At the second demonstration in Vienna, Maxim's gun was sabotaged. Someone had tampered with the ammunition, causing the weapon to jam after a few hundred rounds. By the time Maxim discovered the sabotage, it was too late to repair the damage. At the third demonstration, also in Vienna, the Maxim gun worked perfectly. But an unknown person, described in contemporary accounts only as a persuasive gentleman, moved through the crowd of senior military officers, quietly explaining that such a complex weapon could only be manufactured by hand, one at a time. Mass production, he suggested, would be impossible. No army could rely on a weapon that couldn't be produced at scale. The officers walked away unconvinced. Nordenfelt and Zaharoff had won. But Hiram Maxim knew he had a superior product. So instead of fighting Nordenfelt, he proposed a merger. In 1888, under pressure from financial backers, including the Rothschild family and Vickers, the two companies combined to form the Maxim Nordenfelt Guns and Ammunition Company. Zaharoff became their chief salesman, on a commission structure that would make him spectacularly wealthy. Within 2 years, Nordenfelt himself was bankrupt and forced out of the company. Zaharoff, meanwhile, was just getting started. Let's talk about Spain, because this is where Zaharoff's methods become truly Machiavellian. In 1885, a young Spanish naval officer named Isaac Perel designed the first truly functional submarine. Unlike the steam-powered disasters that Nordenfelt was peddling, Peral's submarine used electric propulsion. It had a periscope, a gyroscope, a sliding torpedo launcher, and a servo motor system that kept the vessel stable underwater. It was, by all accounts, a revolutionary invention, decades ahead of its time. Peral demonstrated the submarine successfully before Spanish military officials. The tests were flawless. Spain, on the verge of conflict with the United States, desperately needed this kind of naval advantage. But Zaharoff had other plans. He traveled to Spain repeatedly between 1886 and 1890, ostensibly to sell weapons to the Spanish army. But his real objective was threefold: sabotage Peral's submarine project, secure contracts for his own inferior weapons, and acquire a Spanish munitions factory. To accomplish this, he seduced Pilar de Mugiro y Berruete, a woman with extraordinary political connections. Her father, Fermín Mugiro, was a powerful banker, a close friend of the king, and a leader of the Spanish Conservative Party. She was also the niece of Segismundo Moret, one of Spain's leading progressive thinkers, and she was unhappily married to Francisco de Bourbon, Duke of Marchena, a cousin of King Alfonso XII. Through Pilar, Zaharoff gained access to Spanish palaces, politicians, and military commanders. He used this network to orchestrate a campaign against Peral's submarine. Journalists, many of them on Zaharoff's payroll, began publishing articles questioning the submarine's viability. Politicians raised concerns about cost. Military officials, influenced by Zaharoff's contacts, suddenly grew skeptical. Peral's submarine was sabotaged 4 times during sea trials, though each time the inventor managed to prove the vessel still worked. But it didn't matter. In the end, despite the overwhelming success of Peral's tests, the Spanish government pulled funding for the project. The submarine that could have changed the course of the Spanish-American War was shelved. Meanwhile, Zaharoff succeeded in acquiring Euskalduna, one of Spain's best armament companies, renaming it Plasencia de las Armas Company, Ltd. And when the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Zaharoff's company sold the Spanish government weapons that were, according to later investigations, largely useless. He also allegedly provided sensitive Spanish military information to Maxim, which found its way to the U.S. government during the conflict. After the war, accusations of bribery and corruption flew in every direction. A Spanish Navy lawyer accused the government of crimes related to the arms deals. The government responded by imprisoning hundreds of naval officers and dismissing the chief of staff and the head of the Navy's legal service. Zaharoff, untouched by the scandal, was awarded exclusive naval construction rights for the Spanish Navy through Vickers' Spanish subsidiary. His power in Spain would last until his death in 1936, the year the Spanish Civil War began. By 1897, Zaharoff had become so wealthy and influential that he was no longer just a salesman. He was a shareholder, and eventually a board member, of Vickers, one of the largest armaments manufacturers in the world. This gave him something more valuable than money. It gave him control over the flow of weapons across Europe. And Zaharoff understood that the best way to sell weapons wasn't just to arm one side of a conflict, it was to arm all of them. During the early 1900s, as European powers raced to modernize their militaries, Vickers, with Zaharoff's guidance, supplied weapons to Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire simultaneously. When Russia suffered a devastating defeat by Japan in 1905, the Russian Navy desperately needed to rebuild. But Russian protectionist policies required that the weapons be manufactured domestically. No problem. Zaharoff built a massive arms production complex in Sarits in Russia, a subsidiary of Vickers that technically counted as a domestic manufacturer. Russia got its weapons. Vickers got its money. Zaharoff got his commission, but the most revealing document came later, after the Russian Revolution, when Tsarist archives were opened to the public. One letter dated 1907 was written from the Paul von Gontar factory in Germany, a company secretly controlled by Vickers, to a Vickers associate in Paris. The letter recommended that press releases be sent to French newspapers suggesting that France needed to increase military spending to counter the threat of German rearmament. The French press published the articles. The German Reichstag saw the articles and voted to increase its own military budget in response. Both countries bought more weapons from the same company. This was the hidden mechanism, a feedback loop of fear, carefully engineered through the press, that turned national insecurity into profit. And Zaharoff wasn't working alone. He had allies in government, in journalism, in finance. Together, they formed an invisible network that operated across borders, manipulating public opinion and policy in ways that served their interests. This is what made Zaharoff so dangerous. He didn't just sell weapons. He sold the narrative that made those weapons necessary. To support his arms business, Zaharoff began acquiring other instruments of power. In the years just before the World War I, he purchased l'Union Parisienne des Banques, a bank historically tied to heavy industry, giving him control over the financing of arms deals. He gained control of Excelsior, a popular French daily newspaper, ensuring favorable editorials for the arms industry and the ability to shape public opinion. He founded a retirement home for ex-French Navy sailors and established a chair in aerodynamics at the University of Paris. Projects designed to build public goodwill and legitimacy. He also funded chairs at St. Petersburg State University, Imperial College in London, and Oxford University. These weren't just acts of philanthropy. They were investments in influence, creating networks of gratitude and obligation among academic and political elites. In April 1914, just months before the war, Zaharoff donated £20,000 to help France prepare for the 1916 Olympic Games in Berlin. The Games, of course, would never happen. The war made sure of that. But the donation served its purpose. On July 31, 1914, the same day that French anti-militarist Jean Jaurès was assassinated, French President Raymond Poincaré signed a decree appointing Zaharoff a commander of the Legion of Honor. The war began 4 days later. World War I was the culmination of everything Zaharoff had built. During the course of the war, Vickers, under Zaharoff's influence, produced 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 53 submarines, 2,328 cannons, 8 million tons of steel ordnance, 90,000 mines, 22,000 torpedoes, 5,500 airplanes, and 100,000 machine guns. By 1915, Zaharoff had close personal ties with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and French Prime Minister Aristide Briand. On one visit to Briand's office, Zaharoff quietly left an envelope on the Prime Minister's desk. Inside was 1 million francs, officially designated as a donation for war widows. But Zaharoff's role went beyond supplying weapons. He was also a political operative. One of his primary tasks was to bring Greece into the war on the Allied side. This seemed nearly impossible. Greece's King Constantine was the brother-in-law of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany. But Zaharoff set up a press agency in Greece to distribute British propaganda, coordinated by Wellington House, Britain's wartime propaganda bureau. Within months, the Greek political landscape shifted. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, Zaharoff's close ally, orchestrated King Constantine's overthrow. Greece entered the war as an ally of the British Empire. In 1917 and 1918, on the direct request of David Lloyd George, Zaharoff initiated secret peace negotiations with the Ottoman Empire. The British hoped he could convince the three pashas, the Ottoman leaders, to abandon Germany and make a separate peace with the Allies. The negotiations ultimately failed, but the fact that Zaharoff was trusted with such a mission shows how deeply embedded he was in the machinery of British foreign policy. By the end of the war, the Times of London estimated that Zaharoff had personally spent £50 million in support of the Allied cause. Whether this was generosity or investment is a matter of interpretation. But there's another dimension to Zaharoff's wartime activities that's worth considering. He wasn't just selling weapons and manipulating politics. He was also fascinated by the future of warfare itself. He gave financial support to aviation pioneers in Britain, France, and Russia. He encouraged Hiram Maxim's attempts to build a flying machine, and Zaharoff himself claimed that he and Maxim were the first men to be lifted off the Earth when Maxim tested his experimental aircraft at Bexley in 1894. Whether this claim was true or another piece of Zaharoff mythology is impossible to verify, but it reveals something important about his mindset. He wasn't content to profit from existing technologies. He wanted to shape the future of combat, to be present at the birth of every new weapon system that might dominate the next war. This forward-looking vision would serve him well in the post-war years, when he recognized that oil, not steel, would become the new currency of global power. The war ended in 1918, but for Zaharoff, the deals continued. In the chaotic aftermath of World War I, as the Big Four powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, redrew the map of Europe, Zaharoff focused on the smaller nations that the great powers were happy to ignore. In particular, he set his sights on ensuring that Greece received a favorable settlement from the collapsing Ottoman Empire. In 1920, he donated £500 million gold francs to the Greek government to support the Megali idea, a nationalist vision of expanding Greek territory into Asia Minor. Zaharoff convinced his ally, Greek Prime Minister Venizelos, to launch an invasion of Turkey. At first, the Greek army achieved impressive victories, but then Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, took command of the Turkish forces. The Greek army was driven back in a catastrophic defeat. In the elections that followed, King Constantine's loyalists forced Venizelos to flee Greece, but Zaharoff stayed behind. He convinced the same King Constantine, whose overthrow he had orchestrated just years earlier, to attack Turkey again. With Mustafa Kemal now in full control, the venture was doomed from the start. The second Greek invasion ended in disaster. Thousands died. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks were displaced in what became known as the Asia Minor catastrophe. The human cost was staggering. Entire Greek communities in Asia Minor, some that had existed for millennia, were uprooted. Refugees flooded into Greece, overwhelming the country's infrastructure. The trauma of this event would shape Greek politics and identity for generations. Zaharoff's war adventures were no longer celebrated. The press in Paris and London began to turn on him. The mystery man of Europe was now being called the Merchant of Death. But by then, Zaharoff had already moved on to his next ventures. In October 1920, he became involved in the incorporation of a company that would eventually become BP, one of the largest oil corporations in the world. He had foreseen that the future of global power was shifting from steel to petroleum. He also purchased the debt-ridden Société de Bain de Mer, which operated the Monte Carlo casino, the principal source of revenue for the Principality of Monaco. Zaharoff returned the casino to profitability and, through his friendship with Prince Louis II of Monaco, ensured that the Treaty of Versailles included protections for Monaco's sovereignty. These were the protections that Monaco had been gradually losing over 3 centuries. Zaharoff, through his influence with French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, managed to codify Monaco's rights in the treaty that ended the First World War. It was a remarkable feat of diplomatic manipulation, inserting the interests of a tiny principality into a document that was supposed to reshape the entire global order. In September 1924, at the age of 74, Zaharoff finally married the woman he had been involved with for nearly 4 decades, María del Pilar de Mugiro y Berruete, the Duchess of Villafranca de los Caballeros. She was 55 years old and one of the richest women in Spain. Their relationship had begun during Zaharoff's campaigns in Spain in the 1880s. She had opened doors for him, introduced him to kings and ministers, helped him acquire companies and contracts. Some historians suggest that Zaharoff attributed much of his professional success to his sexual prowess and the relationships he cultivated with powerful women. But after nearly 40 years together, they had only 18 months of marriage. She died of an infection on February 24, 1926 in Monte Carlo. Zaharoff was devastated. He began selling off his business assets. He drafted his memoirs. But after the manuscript was stolen by a valet and recovered by police, Zaharoff burned it. Whatever secrets he had carried would remain his own. He spent his final years at the Château de Balancourt, a country estate near Paris that had once belonged to King Leopold II of Belgium. The chateau was filled with works of art and was considered one of the most beautiful estates in France. He lived quietly, surrounded by luxury but largely forgotten by the public. There's a poignant detail about these final years. Zaharoff had also taken in the illegitimate daughter of his friend Jacques Damelin, a fellow Greek and the husband of the famous actress Sarah Bernhardt. The girl named Teresa had been left in a basket on Bernhardt's doorstep. Zaharoff arranged for her to be raised by a surrogate family in Adrianople, and she later became a socialite in Athens. She had relationships with Ernest Hemingway, who called her a Greek princess, and Gabriele D'Annunzio. She even served as a model for Pablo Picasso. This act of kindness, raising another man's child, ensuring her education and place in society, sits strangely alongside everything else we know about Zaharoff. Perhaps it reveals that even the most ruthless operators contain multitudes. Or perhaps it was simply another investment in influence, cultivating connections through personal loyalty. Either way, Teresa remains Zaharoff's ward and lifelong friend until his death. Basil Zaharoff died on November 27, 1936 in Monte Carlo. He was 87 years old. So what do we make of Basil Zaharoff? He was never officially a government agent. He never held political office. He never commanded an army. But his influence shaped the outcomes of wars, the fates of nations, and the flow of global capital for more than half a century. He armed the Greeks and the Turks, the British and the Germans, the Russians and the Ottomans. He sold them weapons knowing full well that many of those weapons were defective, unstable, or obsolete. He sabotaged his competitors. He bribed admirals and politicians. He controlled newspapers and banks. He seduced influential women and built networks of power that stretched across Europe and beyond. And yet, for all his wealth and influence, he remains a ghost. We don't have his memoirs. We don't have detailed records of his meetings. What we have are fragments, letters discovered in archives, testimonies from scandals, rumors passed down through histories written by others. The U.S. Senate's Nye Committee, investigating the arms trade in 1934, found evidence that Zaharoff had received substantial commissions, between 5 and 7%, on American submarines sold to Spain over the course of decades. The 1914 Seaman scandal revealed that Zaharoff had paid large bribes to Japanese Admiral Fuji to secure contracts in the Pacific. But these were just the incidents that became public. How many others were buried? How many politicians received envelopes left on desks? How many journalists were paid to write favorable articles? How many contracts were secured through relationships that never made it into official records? Here's what haunts me about Zaharoff's story. He succeeded not because he was uniquely evil, but because he understood how systems work and how to exploit them. He understood that nations are driven by fear more than reason, that politicians respond to pressure from the press, that military officials can be convinced to buy weapons they don't need if you make them believe their neighbors are doing the same. He understood that war is not an aberration of the international system, it is a feature of it. And if you control the weapons, you control the logic of the system itself. Zaharoff died in 1936, the same year the Spanish Civil War began, a conflict that would serve as a dress rehearsal for World War II. His legacy didn't die with him. The feedback loops he perfected, using the press to stoke fear, selling arms to all sides, leveraging political connections to secure contracts, became the blueprint for the modern military-industrial complex. During World War II, companies like Vickers, Boeing, Lockheed, and others would supply the Allies with unprecedented quantities of weapons. After the war, those same companies would lobby governments to maintain high levels of military spending, warning of new threats, real or imagined, to justify continued production. The Cold War, with its arms races and proxy conflicts, was Zaharoff's world writ large. The difference was scale. Where Zaharoff sold thousands of rifles and dozens of submarines, Cold War arms manufacturers sold millions of rifles and hundreds of nuclear warheads. Where Zaharoff manipulated regional newspapers, defense contractors now lobbied entire governments and shaped foreign policy through think tanks and policy institutes. Today, the global arms trade is worth more than $100 billion annually. The top exporters, the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and China, sell weapons to dozens of nations, often to countries in the same region, with overlapping strategic interests. The logic is the same. Fear drives demand, demand drives production, production drives profit, and profit drives the next war. There's a story about Zaharoff from his later years. In 1920, he donated £20,000 to refurbish the monkey house at the Paris Zoo. When zoo staff received the check, they thought it was a hoax and left it in a drawer for 2 months before finally verifying that it was real. The image is almost absurd. One of the richest men in Europe, a man who had armed empires and toppled kings, quietly funding improvements to a monkey enclosure. But maybe it's fitting, because in the end, Zaharoff understood something fundamental about power. It's not about the grand gestures. It's about the small, invisible transactions. The envelope left on a desk, the conversation in a hallway, the article planted in a newspaper, the relationship cultivated over decades. Power is built in the margins, in the spaces between official records and public knowledge. And the people who understand this, who know how to operate in those spaces, are the ones who truly shape history. Basil Zaharoff never fired a shot, but his fingerprints are on every trigger pulled in the wars he helped create. He was called the mystery man of Europe. But perhaps the real mystery is not who he was. It's why we let men like him shape the world, and why, a century later, we still do.